Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a slow walk through the Roman army. Not the glamorous part with parades, shiny helmets, or Russell Crowe yelling in an arena. No, tonight we're sinking into the quieter, slightly gloomier side of the legions, the part where soldiers decided, for one reason or another, that they really, truly did not want to fight. Now, you might imagine that in ancient Rome, bravery was everything. And yes, they loved to write poems about heroic generals and fearless warriors. But here's the thing. Most soldiers were just normal people. Farmers, poor city kids, men who signed up because they needed the paycheck. And when push came to shove, some of them got cold feet. They refused orders, they deserted, or they just flat out panicked in the middle of battle. And the Romans, well, they did not take that lightly. Refusing to fight wasn't just bad form. It was seen as an infection, a moral disease that could spread through the ranks if you didn't stamp it out immediately. So, naturally, the punishments were harsh. Brutal, yes, but also strangely methodical. So, let's get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe stretch out under a blanket, and let's drift together through the very odd world of Roman military discipline. We'll start with the basic question. Why was Rome so strict about this? The short answer is fear. The Roman army was built on discipline, the way modern armies are built on logistics. You could have the best weapons, the fanciest armor, and even the biggest empire on paper. But if your men broke ranks and ran away, none of that mattered. One coward could turn into a dozen, and a dozen could turn into thousands. Roman generals knew this. They also knew their armies were often far from home, stuck in hostile lands, surrounded by enemies who would happily massacre them if given the chance. So obedience had to be absolute. If a soldier refused to fight, it wasn't just his own problem, it was a threat to everyone. And this is where we meet one of Rome's most infamous solutions: decimation. Yes, that word you've probably heard tossed around in movies and video games, but the original meaning was very literal. To decimate meant to kill 1 out of every 10 men in a disgraced unit, randomly, by lottery. Imagine this. You're in a legion of about 5,000 men. Your cohort, say about 480 soldiers, has just been accused of cowardice. Maybe you dropped your shields and ran. Maybe you refused to advance when ordered. The commander isn't happy. He orders a decimation. You and your friends are divided into groups of 10. Each group draws lots. One man pulls the unlucky token. That man doesn't get executed by the commander. No, he gets executed by the other 9 soldiers in his group, usually by being beaten to death with clubs or stoned, slowly. The survivors, the so-called lucky ones, don't get off easy either. They're forced to live on barley instead of wheat, which in Roman terms was considered degrading because barley was for animals and the poor. And they were often made to camp outside the main fortifications, without shelter. All of this was designed to humiliate, to scare, to make refusing orders so terrifying that even the thought of facing the enemy seemed preferable. And yes, commanders actually used this. Not every day, not casually, but when morale collapsed, they brought it out like a nuclear option. One of the most famous cases comes from Marcus Licinius Crassus, the billionaire general who led Rome's campaign against Spartacus. Crassus wasn't known for being a brilliant strategist. He was more famous for being rich, so rich in fact that people joked he owned half of Rome. But when he took over the fight against Spartacus, he wanted results. His soldiers had already been humiliated multiple times by slave armies. Men who had once fought in arenas were somehow defeating the proud legions of Rome. Soldiers were deserting, refusing to fight, running away. Crassus decided he needed to reestablish discipline, and he chose decimation. Entire cohorts were lined up. 1 in 10 soldiers were executed by their own comrades. The rest were forced to live with the guilt and the shame. According to Roman historians, it worked. The legions toughened up, fought harder, and eventually crushed the rebellion. But whether they fought out of pride or sheer terror, well, that's another question. Now, not every general used decimation. It was expensive in terms of manpower, and it could backfire if soldiers resented the commander too much. Julius Caesar, for instance, preferred a lighter touch. Caesar's style was, let's call it, charismatic manipulation. He liked to be adored by his soldiers. He handed out spoils. He shared their hardships. He gave speeches about glory. But when they stepped out of line, he wasn't above making an example. One story from the Gallic Wars tells us that when a legion mutinied and refused to march, Caesar didn't decimate them. He just picked out a few of the ringleaders and executed them publicly. The rest were shamed, reminded of their duty, and then generously forgiven. And of course, forgiveness felt so much nicer after you just watched a few of your friends lose their heads. Caesar knew exactly what he was doing. Other commanders had their own twists. Augustus, the first emperor, preferred quiet discipline. Instead of mass executions, he'd sometimes exile disobedient soldiers. Just remove them from the ranks, strip them of honor, and send them off to obscurity. In Roman culture, where glory and remembrance were everything, being erased could feel worse than death. Then you have Germanicus, the golden boy of the early empire. When his troops mutinied after Augustus died, refusing to fight until their pay and conditions improved, Germanicus played a clever game. He listened. He sympathized. He even pretended he was going to resign in despair. The soldiers panicked, begged him to stay, and promised loyalty. And then he quietly executed a few troublemakers, just to set the tone. Classic Roman, balance. Carrot first, then stick. But let's step back for a second, because while these punishments sound brutal, they actually tell us something deeper about Rome. The empire wasn't built on genius generals alone. It was built on ordinary men being kept in line through fear, shame, and the occasional bit of bread and circuses. Soldiers refusing to fight was more common than we think. Battles were terrifying. Campaigns dragged on for years. Supplies ran out. And sometimes, soldiers just didn't believe in the cause. Especially later in the empire, when loyalty shifted from Rome itself to individual commanders who promised higher pay. By the 3rd century, things got messy. Entire legions mutinied. Some refused to fight unless their commander was replaced. Others outright killed their officers and declared their own man emperor. At that point, discipline wasn't just about punishment, it was about politics. The army had become kingmakers. Refusing to fight wasn't cowardice anymore, it was leverage. So, to answer the question, what happened to soldiers who refused to fight in ancient Rome? Early on, they were beaten, humiliated, executed, or starved on barley until they got the message. Middle period, they were selectively punished, manipulated, or quietly removed. Later on, sometimes nothing happened at all, because the army was too powerful to discipline. It's a strange arc. Rome started as the strictest, most disciplined army in the world, and it ended with soldiers refusing to fight unless they got what they wanted, which honestly feels like the most Roman thing possible. But don't worry, we're not done yet. We've only set the stage. Next, we'll glide into some very specific case studies. Real soldiers, real commanders. Crassus, remember, was the billionaire of Rome. The man who could apparently buy anything, except maybe military genius. When he finally took charge against Spartacus and the rebel slaves, his army was already demoralized. The legions had been humiliated, more than once, by people they considered beneath them. And soldiers, as they do, started to think, maybe fighting isn't worth it. Crassus had a problem. He couldn't afford another embarrassment, so he revived decimation, the punishment that had been sitting in Rome's toolbox for centuries. Imagine being one of those soldiers, already miserable from marching, hungry, tired, probably annoyed you weren't at home farming. And then, instead of just yelling at you, your commander tells you to line up, draw lots, and maybe be clubbed to death by your best friends. Now, historians tell us Crassus executed thousands of his own men this way. And did it work? Yes, in the sense that his army eventually defeated Spartacus. But it's hard not to wonder whether they were fighting for Rome or just fighting to avoid Crassus. Probably both. Fear can be very motivating when glory fails. But Caesar, oh Caesar, he took a different approach. Caesar always wanted to be the clever one in the room. He wanted loyalty, but not through terror alone. He wanted devotion. And he got it. His soldiers adored him. They called him by name. They marched for him, even when the Senate in Rome told him to disband. They followed him across rivers, into Gaul, into civil war. So what happened when they mutinied? Because, yes, even Caesar's men had their limits. After years in Gaul, fighting endless campaigns, some of his soldiers basically said, "Enough, we want to go home." And you can't really blame them. Crassus could have decimated them. He could have made an example. Instead, he played the part of the disappointed father. He called them citizens. That sounds nice until you realize it was an insult. A Roman soldier valued the title Miles, a soldier, a man of the legions. By calling them citizens, Caesar stripped them of their pride without swinging a sword. He essentially said, "Fine, you're not soldiers anymore, you're just civilians." And it worked like a charm. The men were devastated. They begged him to reconsider. They promised to fight again harder than ever. And Caesar, with a perfectly timed pause, graciously forgave them. Public shaming and then magnanimous forgiveness. Classic Caesar. He got obedience and love at the same time. Now compare that to Augustus, the first emperor. Augustus didn't like mess. He liked order. He wanted to present himself as the father of Rome, the calm figure who had ended decades of civil war, which meant he wasn't into the whole public spectacle of decimation. Too dramatic, too chaotic. Instead, Augustus leaned toward exile, dismissal, or financial punishment. A soldier who refused to fight might be stripped of his honors and quietly removed. Or maybe he'd lose his share of loot. For a Roman, humiliation could cut just as deep as physical pain, especially in an army obsessed with honor, reputation, and paychecks. Augustus also played the long game. He made sure soldiers got retirement benefits, land, money, a pension of sorts. This wasn't kindness, it was bribery. If you wanted your reward after 20 years of service, you'd better keep your head down and obey. So Augustus replaced fear of the whip with fear of losing a comfortable retirement. Honestly, a smarter system. Less blood, more control. But discipline wasn't just about emperors. Let's float forward to Germanicus, Rome's golden boy. Germanicus was charming, handsome, and annoyingly popular. He was also one of the few Roman generals who didn't seem to actively hate his soldiers. When Augustus died and Tiberius took over as emperor, the legions stationed on the Rhine mutinied. They were sick of bad pay. They were tired of harsh conditions. And, conveniently, they didn't really like Tiberius. So they refused orders. They even threatened to march on Rome. And Germanicus, caught in the middle, had to fix this. He tried sympathy first. He listened to their complaints. He promised reforms. But when that didn't settle things, he tried a little bit of theater. He threatened to kill himself right there in front of them, drawing his sword in dramatic fashion. The soldiers panicked. "No, no, don't do that, we love you." And suddenly, they were loyal again. Of course, Germanicus didn't just leave it at that.
He also executed the loudest troublemakers, because Rome always needed a few corpses to prove a point. But notice the balance. Emotion first, punishment second. The carrot and the stick in the same performance. So far, we've been looking at discipline when it worked. When soldiers grumbled, refused, or panicked, and commanders dragged them back into line. But what about when it didn't? Because the later empire, well, let's just say things fell apart. By the 3rd century, the Roman army had grown bloated, expensive, and weirdly political. Soldiers weren't just fighters anymore, they were kingmakers. They realized that if they didn't like the emperor, they could simply refuse to fight until someone else took the throne. And it worked over and over again. Whole units mutinied. Some killed their commanders outright. Others marched on Rome or declared their general emperor. At that point, refusing to fight wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Soldiers weren't afraid of punishment anymore because they were the punishment. They held the real power. One emperor after another rose and fell because of army loyalty, or lack of it. Discipline collapsed into bribery. Emperors had to promise higher pay, richer rewards, more land, just to keep the troops from sitting down and saying, "No thanks, not today." In other words, the empire that once terrified men into obedience now had to grovel for it. Irony at its finest. But let's not get too far ahead, because even in the later periods, punishments still lingered. Commanders still tried to stage discipline when they could. Executions, public shaming, reduced rations. But the scale had shifted. It was no longer a tool to keep a few nervous soldiers in line. It had become a negotiation. And that's really the arc of Rome's military discipline. In the beginning, if you refused to fight, you were crushed. Literally, sometimes, by your friends' clubs. In the middle, you were manipulated, shamed, or quietly exiled. And in the end, you could refuse and maybe get an emperor out of it. Not exactly the tidy system Rome bragged about in its golden age. So, if you're lying there, drifting to sleep, just imagine it. You're a soldier in the Roman camp. You've marched for weeks. Your feet hurt. You're not sure this war is even worth it. You think, maybe I'll just stay behind tomorrow. And then you remember Crassus and his little lottery, or Caesar's fatherly disappointment, or Augustus cutting off pensions. And you sigh. You pick up your shield, and you march anyway. Because in Rome, refusing to fight wasn't just cowardly, it was a gamble. And most men weren't willing to roll those dice. And that, my friends, is where we'll pause. Next time, we'll drift into some very specific case studies. Soldiers whose names actually made it into the record, and how their choices to refuse, desert.
First, let's wander back to the early Republic. Picture a soldier in one of Rome's first professional legions. He's not some grizzled veteran yet. He's a farmer. He's been conscripted because Rome is fighting yet another war with its neighbors, which honestly was basically Rome's entire calendar. And he's standing in line with his shield, looking at the enemy across the field and thinking, nope, not today. What happened to him? Well, in the early days, the punishments were almost embarrassingly simple. If you ran from battle, you could be whipped, publicly flogged, sometimes executed, sometimes fined. It wasn't fancy, but it got the point across. One Roman historian, Livy, tells us about entire units being punished for running. Their commanders made them camp outside the fortifications, like bad school children sent to sit in the hallway. No fire, no tents, just humiliation. Soldiers cared deeply about their dignity, so being treated like failures was its own kind of torture. But Rome loved a good story, and the best-known cases of refusal come later. Take the story of Crassus and the Spartacus War, which we touched on before. Ancient writers like Plutarch loved describing the decimations, but buried in their accounts are glimpses of individual soldiers, men who drew the unlucky lot, men who had to kneel while their comrades beat them to death. We don't know their names. Rome didn't care enough to write them down. But imagine it, one guy out of 10, singled out, not because of what he did, but because of sheer bad luck. Did he cry? Did he beg? Did he accept it calmly, knowing the others had no choice? We'll never know. But his story is there, quietly haunting the margins of history. Then we have Julius Caesar's legions. Caesar gives us more detail, partly because he loved writing about himself. When his soldiers mutinied in Campania, refusing to fight until they got their rewards, he staged that famous humiliation speech. But what's less often remembered is that he did, in fact, execute some men afterward. He picked ringleaders, ordinary soldiers who probably just been loud after a long day. Maybe they shouted too much. Maybe they waved their swords around. Caesar singled them out, and the rest of the army had to watch. It was Rome's way of saying, sure, you can complain, but don't complain too much. Again, no names, just anonymous soldiers swallowed up by Caesar's story, which, if you think about it, is another punishment, being forgotten, being erased from memory. Romans believed deeply in the idea of honor living after death. To die without your name remembered was almost worse than dying in disgrace. And then there's the case of Germanicus's soldiers on the Rhine, during that messy mutiny after Augustus died. Here we actually get some glimpses of personality. Tacitus, the ever-gloomy historian, describes soldiers drunk, angry, refusing to fight, demanding better conditions. One soldier even shouted that Germanicus himself should be emperor instead of Tiberius. Imagine the courage or the stupidity of saying that out loud in front of an armed camp. Caesar tried to calm them, but eventually he executed a few men. Tacitus tells us the soldiers themselves handed over their loudest comrades, desperate to show loyalty again. So here's an irony. Sometimes refusing to fight didn't just get you punished, it made your friends turn on you. They'd hand you over just to save themselves. Rome didn't always need to enforce discipline directly. Fear made the soldiers police themselves. But let's drift even further ahead, into the late empire. By then, the army was a different beast. Soldiers weren't all Roman anymore. Many were recruited from provinces, or even from so-called barbarian tribes. Their loyalty wasn't to Rome, but to their general, or more often, to their paycheck. And this is where refusal to fight gets complicated. There are records of whole units refusing to fight unless they were paid up front. Some even switched sides mid-battle, walking calmly over to the enemy because they hadn't been fed in weeks. Imagine the sheer audacity of that. In earlier centuries, they would have been executed on the spot. In the late empire, commanders often had to shrug and bargain. One famous story comes from the reign of Emperor Valens in the 4th century. His troops were restless, underfed, and unmotivated. Some flatly refused to fight the Goths at Adrianople. Valens, desperate, marched them into battle anyway. The result? A total disaster. The Roman army was crushed. Valens was killed, and historians later pointed to the soldiers' lack of discipline as one reason. Refusal, in this case, doomed not just a unit, but an entire campaign. Now, what about desertion? That's a special kind of refusal. Not just saying, I won't fight, but literally walking away. Desertion was one of Rome's greatest fears. Punishment was usually death. If you were caught, you might be crucified. Yes, crucified. The same way Rome punished slaves. It was deliberately degrading,
A Roman soldier was supposed to die with honor, in battle. To be nailed to a cross like a criminal was the ultimate humiliation. And yet, desertion kept happening, especially during civil wars. Soldiers didn't always know which side to trust. Why fight for one general when another promised better rewards? So men slipped away, hoping to join a rival army or just disappear back home. Roman writers fumed about it, but the fact that they wrote about it so often tells us it was common. Refusing to fight wasn't rare. It was normal. So, what's the pattern here? It seems like every time Rome punished refusal, it tried to make it public. Whether it was flogging, execution, decimation, or crucifixion, the point was always the same: make everyone else watch. Turn one man's fate into a lesson. But in the quieter details, you can see the cracks. Soldiers begging Caesar to forgive them. Men turning on their comrades to save themselves. Units demanding pay before fighting. The punishments were harsh, but they weren't perfect. People resisted anyway. And maybe that's the most Roman thing of all. The empire loved to project strength. But behind the speeches, the monuments, and the marble, it was still just made of people. Tired, scared, stubborn people who sometimes said no. So, if you're listening now, eyes heavy, drifting off, just imagine the scene. A Roman soldier stands in line. The commander gives the order. The trumpet sounds, and he hesitates. Maybe his shield feels too heavy. Maybe he's thinking about the farm he left behind. Maybe he simply doesn't care about this war. And in that hesitation, you can hear the quiet truth of Rome. Discipline wasn't natural. It had to be forced. And forcing it was always messy. And on that note, let's leave our nameless soldiers for the night. Next, we'll float into the broader consequences, how Rome's obsession with discipline shaped its rise, and how the collapse of that discipline helped bring the empire down.
We've wandered through the punishments, the executions, the mutinies, the unlucky men who drew the short straw. But now let's step back a little. Instead of staring at that one poor soldier kneeling in the dirt, let's take in the bigger picture. Because refusal to fight wasn't just about one man being stubborn. Over time, it became a symptom of something larger, something that slowly helped bring down the empire. From the very beginning, Rome built its identity on discipline. Ask any Roman senator, and they'd repeat the same line: Rome wins wars because Roman soldiers never break. That was their myth, their favorite bedtime story. But of course, it wasn't true. Soldiers did hesitate, they did run, and sometimes they flat out said no. The more it happened, the more it chipped away at that carefully crafted myth. By the late Republic, when generals like Caesar and Pompey had armies loyal to themselves rather than the Senate, discipline started looking negotiable. Soldiers fought because their general promised them gold, land, or maybe just didn't execute them that morning. Loyalty to Rome itself was secondary. When fighting became a matter of reward first and discipline second, refusal was never far behind. Civil wars made it worse. Imagine being a Roman soldier ordered to fight your own countryman, your cousin, your neighbor, or the general you followed last year who's suddenly been declared an enemy of the state. The old punishments, flogging, crucifixion, decimation, were harder to enforce when half the unit secretly sympathized with the man refusing. Killing one soldier for cowardice might just spark a mutiny. So soldiers resisted quietly. They dragged their feet. They fought half-heartedly, or they simply deserted. Not always dramatic, but deadly for discipline all the same. By the time of the emperors, discipline had less to do with fear and more to do with economics. If you paid soldiers well, they fought. If you didn't, they didn't. The Praetorian Guard, supposedly the most loyal of all, proved this perfectly. They protected emperors until they didn't. If the pay fell short, they assassinated their own bosses, or worse, auctioned off the throne itself. as they did in the year 193. Picture it, guards on the palace wall shouting, "Who wants to buy the empire?" That isn't refusal in one battle, it's refusal to fight for Rome itself, unless the price was right. Fast forward to the late empire, and the problem magnifies. Rome's armies were packed with recruits from outside Italy, Goths, Franks, Syrians. Their loyalty was shallow. Generals had to bribe them constantly with promises of land or food. Soldiers sometimes refused to march until their rewards were delivered up front. Others switched sides mid-battle. Some just camped in place, shields stacked neatly, waiting until their general caved. By then, Rome couldn't afford to punish refusal. You couldn't crucify a tenth of your already shrinking army. Fear stopped working, so compromise became the only option. The disaster at Adrianople in 378 showed the cracks. Emperor Valens led his troops against the Goths, but his men were hungry, restless, and reluctant. Some didn't fight at all. The result was a massacre, and Valens himself died, possibly burned alive in a farmhouse. Historians later blamed discipline, or the lack of it, for the loss. Refusal wasn't an isolated weakness anymore, it was an empire-wide disease. If you trace the spiral, it looks something like this. Early Rome thrived on brutal punishments that made refusal rare. Middle Rome wavered as civil wars blurred loyalties. Imperial Rome turned soldiers into mercenaries with constant bribes. And late Rome saw refusal practically normalized. The irony is sharp. Rome conquered the world by terrifying its own men more than the enemy. For centuries, it worked. But fear can only hold people together for so long. Eventually, soldiers realized that not fighting was more powerful than fighting. Refusal became leverage, a bargaining chip, and with every bribe, every compromise, Rome lost a little more of the iron discipline that had once made it unstoppable. So picture it, if you're still awake. A Roman camp at dusk. The banners hang heavy. The general shouts, pacing in the dust. But the men just sit by their fires. Their swords are sharp, their shields are stacked, but they don't move. One by one, they shake their heads. And in that quiet refusal, you can hear the sound of an empire slowly unraveling.
And yet, even after all of this, the question lingers like smoke in the air. How did people at the time actually think about all these refusals? Because if there's one thing Romans hated almost as much as losing, it was admitting that they had lost because their own men didn't cooperate. Pride had to be preserved, so they invented ways of smoothing the story over. Ancient historians, especially the ones writing for senators or emperors, were masters at spin. A battle was never lost because the soldiers got fed up and sat down. No, it was lost because of bad omens, because the gods were in a mood, or because a general miscalculated. Soldier refusal was often disguised as confusion on the battlefield or unfortunate delays. Basically, creative excuses wrapped up in official Latin. Of course, if the refusal was too obvious to hide, writers still framed it in moral language. The men weren't lazy, they were corrupted by foreign luxuries. Or they weren't cowards, they were led astray by greedy commanders. That way, the blame shifted conveniently away from the men themselves and onto vague moral decay. Which, by the way, was the Roman historian's favorite explanation for everything. Crops fail, moral decay. Too much wine imported from Gaul, moral decay. Soldiers deserting, also moral decay. Very tidy. Later writers in the Christian era leaned even harder on this angle. For them, Rome didn't fall because of economics or military disobedience, it fell because the empire had turned sinful. Soldiers refusing to fight wasn't a practical labor dispute, it was a sign of divine punishment. God was, in their eyes, pulling the plug on Rome. And so the quiet mutiny of an unpaid soldier by a campfire became part of a grand cosmic narrative. But if you look closely at the real accounts, you see the little human details slip through. complaints about late pay, grumbles about rotten grain rations, mutters that the general was clueless. You could almost hear the voices of tired men who didn't see themselves as part of some great historical morality play. They just didn't want to die that day for someone else's ambition. And honestly, who can blame them? The irony is that centuries later, Europeans held up Roman discipline as the gold standard. Renaissance generals would lecture their troops about Roman order. Enlightenment thinkers admired how the legions supposedly never broke. 19th century officers compared their armies to Caesar's. The myth of iron Roman discipline lived on, shiny and untarnished, while the messy reality of mutinies and refusals quietly gathered dust in the footnotes. It was much more comforting to believe in an eternal legion than to imagine ordinary men grumbling about dinner. Still, the myth mattered. By believing in it, later rulers tried to copy it. Prussian drill sergeants, Napoleonic officers, even modern armies all borrowed something from the idea of absolute obedience in the Roman style. Whether it worked any better for them is, well, debatable. But the fact that Rome's soldiers had often done the opposite, refused, deserted, negotiated, was conveniently left out of the story. It's a reminder that history is often more about how we want to remember than how it really happened. And maybe that's the quietest punchline here. Rome, the empire built on fear, ended up remembered not for its disobedience, but for its discipline. The very thing that cracked and broke became the thing that survived in legend. Which makes you wonder how much of our own history will be remembered the same way, with the inconvenient refusal scrubbed away and only the shiny myths left behind. So if you're drifting off now, picture it one last time. The campfires glowing at night, a line of weary men sharpening swords they won't use, a general muttering threats that fall into silence, the banners drooping in the dusk air, Rome, eternal on paper, already fraying in reality. And somewhere in that gap, between the story told and the truth lived, you can almost hear the faint, stubborn echo of those soldiers who simply chose not to fight.
And the truth is, Rome wasn't alone in this. Armies throughout history have always had the same quiet problem. Soldiers get tired. They get hungry. They get fed up with leaders who seem more interested in glory than survival. Refusal is older than the empire, and it's lasted longer too. If you look back at Greece, for example, even those famously disciplined Spartans weren't immune. They're remembered as the men who never ran, the warriors who supposedly bathed in hardship and liked it. But ancient sources quietly admit that Spartan soldiers sometimes dragged their feet. They weren't robots. At the Battle of Sphacteria, an entire group of Spartans surrendered to the Athenians. The shockwaves across Greece were enormous because Spartans simply weren't supposed to quit. And yet they did, proving once again that myth and reality rarely line up. The Persians had the same problem. Their empire spanned so far, across so many different peoples, that motivating soldiers could be a nightmare. If you're a conscripted farmer from some province 2 months' march away, why exactly would you throw yourself into battle for a king you've never seen? Refusal wasn't always open rebellion. It was just slow walking, sloppy fighting, and letting yourself drift to the back of the line, which, incidentally, was safer. Even Alexander the Great, whose men supposedly adored him, faced mutiny. They'd followed him across deserts, mountains, and rivers, watched him chase glory into India, and finally just said, enough. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to march any further. Alexander raged, sulked, tried to shame them with speeches. It didn't work. The greatest conqueror of the age had to turn around, not because he'd lost to an enemy, but because his own soldiers simply decided they were done. Sound familiar? Rome wasn't unique. The difference was that Rome made discipline into its entire brand. The Romans wrote manuals, drilled endlessly, crucified deserters, decimated units. They built the whole identity of the legion around obedience. So when refusal cracked through anyway, it felt bigger, more dangerous, almost like a betrayal of the empire's core myth. And yet, if you squint, you see that Roman soldiers were just like everyone else. They wanted food, pay, respect, maybe a share of loot. When they didn't get it, they balked, sometimes with silence, sometimes with desertion, sometimes with dramatic mutiny. But it was never really about Roman glory or empire or destiny. It was about basic human survival. That's probably the most grounding way to think about it. We love to imagine history as this grand theater of larger-than-life figures, armies marching with perfect precision, emperors pulling the strings. But behind all that, history was lived by tired men in dusty camps, weighing whether to risk death in battle or quietly hold back. Most of them weren't trying to change the world, they were just trying to make it to tomorrow. And in a way, that's what makes the refusals in Rome so interesting. They remind us that no matter how much an empire glorifies discipline or how many myths it builds, reality is always more fragile. You can't drill human hesitation out of existence. You can punish it, you can bribe it, you can cover it up in official histories, but it's always there, waiting by the campfire. So when Rome fell, centuries later, historians debated whether it was because of barbarian invasions or bad emperors or economic collapse. All of those reasons matter, of course, but tucked quietly into the story is the more mundane truth that sometimes the men with the swords simply wouldn't lift them. The empire's fate depended not only on emperors and senators, but on ordinary soldiers making ordinary decisions. And if you lean back now, half asleep, it's almost comforting. Empires rise and fall, but human stubbornness is eternal. Rome thought it could erase refusal with fear. It thought it could replace refusal with gold. In the end, refusal stayed, quiet and patient, until the empire itself was the thing that disappeared.
The psychology of refusal is a strange thing to explore, because it isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like open rebellion, soldiers clashing with their commanders in a swirl of rage and steel. But most of the time it's quieter than that, a slow resistance that starts with small choices, moving a little slower on the march, letting the edge of your sword dull, watching your commander's back with a little less loyalty than before. A Roman soldier had to carry so much weight, both on his body and in his mind. Armor, shield, rations, tools, all bundled on a frame that might already be worn down from poor food and long marches. The equipment itself was heavy, but heavier still was the expectation. Rome wanted him to believe he was more than a man, that he was part of a machine that never broke, a wall of iron that moved as one. The stories told him so, the punishments reinforced it. But human minds crack differently. Imagine a man standing in the dust before battle, staring across at an enemy he doesn't know, whose cause he doesn't care about. His stomach knots, his hands tremble, and in that instant, refusal can slip in like a shadow. He doesn't throw down his sword, doesn't shout that he's done. He just hesitates. He lingers in the back. Maybe he decides to let the front ranks go first, telling himself he'll catch up later. In Rome, that tiny hesitation was as dangerous as a full-blown mutiny. Generals knew this, which is why so much of their energy wasn't just about strategy, it was about performance. Roman generals gave speeches before battles, not because words alone could guarantee victory, but because they needed to reach into that fear, twist it, and turn it into rage or pride, or something other than hesitation. Caesar was a master of it. He'd speak to his men as if they were partners, telling them that their bravery had carried him this far, that together they were invincible. He flattered them, promised them rewards, invoked their honor, and the men, swept up in his charisma, often marched where logic told them they shouldn't. Other commanders relied on ritual. Rome's religion was full of omens, sacrifices, signs from the gods. Before battle, priests might examine animal entrails, searching for divine approval. If the signs were good, it reassured the soldiers they weren't just marching to death, they were marching with the gods on their side. If the signs were bad, well, sometimes commanders quietly reported them as good anyway. Truth bent easily when morale was on the line.
Bribery worked too. Promising loot, land, or gold could turn hesitation into eagerness. Roman soldiers weren't blind to wealth. Many of them were poor farmers or landless laborers. Fighting wasn't just survival, it was one of the few paths upward. So when generals promised rich rewards after victory, refusal often softened. The risk seemed worth it. Of course, if those rewards didn't come, mutiny was never far behind. And yet, for all these tricks, refusal still broke through. One of the most famous disasters in Roman history, the Battle of Carrhae in 53 DCE, was born out of hesitation and disobedience. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, led an army against the Parthians. His men didn't trust him, didn't believe in the campaign, and when things turned sour, discipline crumbled, units faltered, soldiers refused orders, and the Parthians slaughtered them. Crassus himself died in humiliation, his defeat a reminder that even the richest Roman couldn't buy unwavering obedience. Caesar, too, brushed against refusal more than once. His men adored him, yes, but adoration has limits when the cold bites and the hunger gnaws. In Spain, his troops once mutinied, demanding discharge and pay. He didn't crush them with force, he played them with words, sarcastically calling them citizens instead of soldiers. The sting of it, the shame of being reminded that they weren't living up to their own self-image, was enough to bring them back in line. He didn't need executions that time, just clever manipulation. The Varian disaster in the Teutoburg forest is another story woven with refusal. Publius Quintilius Varus marched into Germania with 3 legions, led astray by a supposed ally named Arminius. The soldiers followed, but unease hung over the march. Forests closed in, supply lines stretched thin, and the rowel sagged. When the ambush came, discipline broke. Some soldiers refused to fight at all, choosing instead to flee into the trees. Others collapsed under panic. Varus himself fell on his sword. Rome had always imagined itself indestructible, but here in the dripping German woods, ordinary men decided they would rather run than die for empire. Refusal didn't need to be large-scale to matter. Even one man's hesitation could ripple outward, infecting a unit like a sickness. Fear is contagious, and the sight of someone stepping back can embolden the man beside him to do the same. Roman commanders knew this too, which is why punishments were often public. Crucifixions, decimations, floggings, they weren't just about the man being punished, but about sending a message to everyone watching. Still, the psychology of refusal is stubborn. Fear, hunger, doubt, they creep in no matter how much gold or honor is dangled before a soldier. Generals could only fight it with speeches, rituals, and threats. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, Rome's iron machine groaned and cracked, reminding the world that beneath the armor and the discipline, the legions were just men.